The reason why I won't return them to you on Wednesday is we're going to have another recorded meeting for Wednesday's class. And I prefer not to do it that way, but it's better than just canceling class. We don't fall behind. We don't have to reschedule it for another time. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who had to go out of town for a conference, and so he canceled our normal class, which started at 9 a.m. And then when he came back, he wanted to make up those classes, and so he had us come in at 7 a.m. to make up the classes, because he had an 8 o'clock class, so it wouldn't work for him to have it at 8. So we had class at 7 a.m., an hour break, and then our normal class to get back on schedule. That's how we did it. So it could be worse, right? Listening to those videos is pretty painful, but it's not as bad as being here at 7 a.m. All right, so class on Wednesday is online. I'll email you the link to that, and you can also find the link on Blackboard, same as Friday's class. And just like Friday's class, I'll also email you the PDF file that you should print out and have in front of you when you go through the video, because it'll be the in-class exercise. And so my intention is that when you have a recorded video, to pause at certain points in the recording, work through the in-class exercise. Don't just let the video play and then write down the answer to the in-class exercise, because you don't really learn as much if you're just copying the solution as you do thinking through it and not having the answer right there in front of you. So I'll post that on Blackboard, and I'll email it to you. Any questions about the announcements? Homework on Friday, class on Wednesday, online. All right. Anybody already taken a sneak look at homework number 2? Good. A couple people. The early bird gets the worm, and I guess that's a good thing. The worm is a good thing. So get started on that homework. All right. Just to reiterate a point that was made in the class on Friday, the effect of compounding is bigger for large interest rates. So compare what happens in the 6% column with what happens in the 24% column. When you have a relatively low interest rate, the difference between annual compounding and daily compounding is relatively minor. 0.18% is the difference between the nominal and the effective. But when you have a high interest rate to begin with, like 24%, the difference between annual and daily compounding is really significant, an extra 3% interest just based on the compounding frequency. So the trend that you should take away from this is that the higher the interest rate, the larger the difference is between the effective and the nominal. And then the other thing is that when you go with more frequent compounding, like look at the difference between annual and semi-annual. So instead of compounding once per year, you're compounding twice. So that's a jump of 0.09%. But then doubling again doesn't get you the same increase. Going from 2 to 4 only increases it by 0.05, not by the first increment of 0.09. So there's kind of a leveling effect, or diminishing returns is another way to put it. That it's not like we could compound on a minute or a second basis and then it would be significantly different. Continuous compounding is essentially the same effect as daily compounding. All right. Now, does anybody remember this figure? I showed it earlier in the semester. What's the story of this figure? Do you remember what's kind of like the take-home message or the illustration of this figure? Yes?
The more money you give, the higher risk that it'll be paid back.
All right. So from the perspective of the borrower, no, the lender, the more you give, the higher the risk that it won't be paid back. That's perfect. Right. So what it's showing is that as the cumulative amount borrowed or loaned goes up, the interest rate is higher. And so he remembered that the interest rate is going up because the risk is going up. And this figure isn't necessarily about a higher repayment period, although that may also be an effect. This figure is all about risk. And so the more a person borrows, the higher the risk there is that they won't repay it. Okay, so now I'm going to add to this figure in today's class. And what I'm going to add is some possible projects a company could do. And think about a company that maybe is in the business having to do with computer-related stuff. They could upgrade their computer network. They could buy new delivery trucks. There's just all these things that they could do if they had more money. And they do an analysis to try and figure out if they did this thing, how much of a return would they get? You know, for instance, if you spent $100 on upgrading your computer network, how much would you get back by investing that $100? Would you get back $140? So if so, then your return on that investment would be 40%. So each of these has been analyzed to try and figure out what's the return on the investment. How much does it cost and what's the return? This next figure is going to illustrate both. Now first, how much does it cost? The width of each column is indicating the cost that's associated with doing it. So for example, option A was upgrade the computer network. How much does it cost to upgrade the computer network? How many dollars? $500,000-$600,000? Right. Okay, so the width of it, if we go down here to the horizontal axis, it's not $1 million, it's a little more than $500,000. Okay, option B, it looks like the cost of option B is probably $1.4 million. It goes from $600,000 to about $2 million. So option B costs $1.4 million. Option C, that's an expensive one. To do option C is about $2.1 million, and so on and so forth. So you can see what the investment for each of those is. Now the height of that, this curve means the same thing that it always meant. It's how much the lender is going to charge to borrow a certain amount of money. But this is now what's your return on that project. So project A would give us a 35% return. Project B gives you 30% return, and so on and so forth. So let me ask you a hypothetical. What if you could borrow money for 10% and you could do something with it that gives you 35%? Is that a good project?
Yes.
Yeah, it's an excellent project because you give the 10% to the bank and you keep the rest for yourself. So project A is a yes. That's a thumbs up. We should do project A because the return is greater than our cost of borrowing. Project B is a yes. C is a yes. All of these are a yes until we get down to project F. Now what's wrong with project F? Who wants to take a stab at explaining why we would reject alternative F? Yeah.
I think you wouldn't get any returns back.
You wouldn't get any returns back. Why is that? You're right, but why?
The cost is the same as the amount you're borrowing.
Okay, so you would have to pay 16% to the bank, but you're only getting 16% for that project. So in other words, you'd be going through the motions of this project and all of the profits would be turned over to the lender. And you definitely wouldn't want to do project G. That's even worse because it's costing you, I don't know, at this point maybe 17, 18% to borrow the money, and you're only getting 14%. So there's a decision criteria here. And I think this is the first time you're hearing me use a very important phrase, decision criteria. This is maybe one of the most important phrases you'll hear all semester long. And a decision criteria is a rule that you use to make a decision of yes or no, or you're making a decision between option A and option B. It's essentially how you know what you should do. And this course is about understanding money, but it's more than that. It's understanding money to make decisions. And so our decision criteria that's implied here is that you'd never do a project when the rate of return is more than the borrowing costs. So here the abbreviation MARR is used, and that stands for minimum acceptable rate of return. And so because of this company's borrowing costs, their MARR is 16% per year. They won't accept any project that isn't greater than 16% per year. If they accepted 16, they wouldn't lose money, but they also wouldn't be gaining money for that particular project. And so their MARR is, it must be greater than 16%. minimum acceptable rate of return. There's lots of different things that can go into what a company sets as its MARR. It's like a policy decision. The board of directors, the president, the CEO, the CFO, everybody gets together in management and they periodically review what is their target return for projects. And it may be having to do with borrowing costs, but it can be other factors as well. It's a policy decision, and we've already talked about how the borrowing costs is maybe the most important of the decisions that go into what you set as your MARR. And the weighted average cost of capital, not all money is borrowed from the bank. A company may sell stock to raise money. They may sell bonds. They may have some sort of a collaborative partnership where another company takes a stake in the project. So you'd come up with an overall average cost of the capital that you're borrowing and raising to do the project, and I'll show you some calculations related to that in just a moment. Another factor that determines what your MARR is going to be is how many good projects you've got. If a company only has one or two good ideas, then they can't afford to be so picky. You know, they're going to accept whatever projects they can get. And from business to business it varies as well. Like the grocery industry is notorious for having really low margins. You know, companies like Kroger or Food Fair, because it costs them so much to have the inventory in the store, and they have a lot of rent costs because it's a big facility, and a lot of labor expenses, and you know, the spoilage of the food and so on. The grocery industry is lucky to get 1 or 2% on the capital that they invest, whereas technology companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, they have the potential for much higher returns and seemingly maybe more projects as well. Another factor that plays into this decision is opportunity cost. And opportunity cost is defined as the value of your second best option. So it's the thing that you could have been doing if you didn't do the other thing. So for instance, if you spend money on one project, you can't use that dollar, that same dollar, to invest in another project. And so that kind of plays into what you set your MARR at, is if you have lots of great projects with a high return, then you're not going to select projects that have a lower return because maybe you'd run out of money for the good ones. Risk is another factor. The cost of administering projects. And then finally, the organization type. Private companies generally will insist on a higher rate of return than public entities, like a nonprofit water utility. A nonprofit water utility would maybe be willing to upgrade their pipeline, even though it's going to give them a very small rate of return, compared to a private company where they have to get a better rate of return than they could have just taken the money and invested it at the bank. So they're always thinking about, what else could I have done with this money? And so for-profit organizations generally require a higher MARR than nonprofits like hospitals and government agencies and so on. All right, money can come from equity, which is an ownership interest in a company. If you own stock, then you're a part owner of a company. That's one way to raise money. Another is through debt financing. And debt financing can be borrowing money from a bank or selling bonds. And the rule is that you want your rate of return for a project to be greater than, or at the very least equal to, your minimum accepted rate of return, and that should be greater than the cost of capital. Otherwise, you're turning over your profits to whoever you're borrowing the money from. So what is your opportunity cost? You're here in this room right now, which means you're not doing other things. You could be asleep, you could be working out, you could be having some other job. You know, here is an illustration of a headline I saw a while back where it was saying that people in the aviation maintenance industry, there are jobs where people can graduate from high school and then with just a little bit of on-the-job training start making $70,000 a year. That was, I guess there's a high school in New York City area that's an aviation high school. And you get some basic certificate when you graduate from there, and you don't make $70,000 a year right out of high school, but within, I think they said, 3 years of graduating from this aviation high school, while you're getting paid along the way, then you can be like a full-blown aircraft mechanic making $70,000. So, you know, if you're here, you're not doing that. Or if you're here, you're not driving a truck. Walmart is hiring drivers who can make nearly $90,000 a year. So there's a second best alternative that you could have been doing, and so that's your opportunity cost. Companies also have opportunity costs. So the definition is it's the value of the second best option, or if you look at all the projects that you couldn't do because you ran out of money, it's the largest rate of return of all the projects that you could have done but you didn't have enough money for. So let's say, for instance, that your company's MARR is 10%. If you only had enough money to do project B and you couldn't do project A, then your opportunity cost would be 13%. So opportunity cost is different from MARR. It's just the value of your second best alternative. In this case, the best alternative was the project that gives 15%. But then if you ran out of money because you did B and you can't do A, then that makes the opportunity cost 13%. Okay, here's the last slide I'm going to show you before I give you the in-class exercise paper for today. This is a summary of the formula for a weighted average. You've probably done weighted averages before. It's different than a simple average. A simple average is where you just combine numbers together and then divide by how many numbers there are. So the average of 1, 2, and 3, you'd add 1 plus 2 plus 3 and then divide by 3. So that's a simple average. In a weighted average, you take into account how much of each thing there is. And so its value is weighted by the proportion. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen as I give you the in-class exercise because you're going to need this for one of the problems where I talk about a company that's borrowing money at different interest rates. All right. Maybe I'll bring it back up on the screen because I want to include the actual handout in the video. So let me bring that up. All right, opportunity cost is just what you would have been doing if you weren't here at the university. So for me, I could have started working maybe, for instance, for the railroad, and I would have earned income instead of paying tuition during the 8+ years I was in college. All right, so for question 2, what we're doing is we're comparing the borrowing costs to their anticipated returns. So A is a good project because we get 9%, and to borrow the money, 5-year, AA rated, is only 2.22%. So the return is bigger than the loan rate. So here's my decision criteria. Any project where the project return is larger than the loan rate, then I accept that project, which means I accept A, C, D, and E, and then reject the ones where the project return is less than the borrowing cost. So here's some of the things that would affect whether a company is A-rated or AA rated. This is actually a thing. Companies do get a grade, and there are credit rating agencies where you've probably heard about a credit score for people. Well, companies have credit scores too. And Moody's is the name of one company that gives credit scores to companies, and they'll tell you what they rate a company's creditworthiness. And so here are some of the factors that may go into how well rated a company is, like how long it's been in business and those sorts of factors. All right, finally, question 4, calculating the weighted average cost of capital. So you could calculate the dollar amount that's going to come from the bank loan and the dollar amount that's going to come from the bonds and how many dollars will come from preferred stocks. You could have calculated the dollars out of the $220 million that comes from each, but it's just as easy to set the amount as the percentage that's coming from each. So in this weighted average, you can see that the number of 5.99% is different than the simple average, which I put up on the whiteboard. The simple average is just 6.27%. But since more of the money comes from this low cost, the 4.5%, that brings the weighted average down. You know, a simple average is essentially saying that 33.3% of the money comes from each of the different sources. But here, you're getting a different amount of money from each possibility. And so the average depends on how much you got from each source. So that's your first taste of a weighted average cost of capital. Now, I'd encourage you to get an early look on that homework assignment. You can start on it now, and while it's fresh in your mind, make some easy progress on the assignment. Remember that on Wednesday, the class is online. I'll send you the link to that, and then I'll see you in class for Friday.